Hello. Hello and good morning. Good Monday morning. I think we're rolling, and it officially tells me we are. Today, we're going to start uh, a very interesting, I think, a very interesting chapter um, called The Exorcism of Our Lady of Sorrows. Uh, it was written in several parts, and I'm going to read it in sections too, because otherwise it'd just take up your whole morning if I did otherwise. But anyway, here it is. I hope you had a good weekend and you're ready to uh, exercise your your week. So this is chapter 13, of course, of Low Magic. It's all in your head. You just have no idea how big your head is. The Exorcism of Our Lady of Sorrows. Part 1. A School Possessed. The epigram is from St. Teresa of Avila. I don't fear Satan half as much as I fear those who fear him. Perhaps the most dramatic example of low magic, at least as we're defining the term in this book, is the art of exorcism. Exorcism reaches back into prehistory, and together with the rites of fertility and the hunt, vies for the title of humanity's oldest spiritual practice. Writing about exorcism is, in its own way, as dangerous as exorcism itself. Perhaps more so, as there's so much opportunity for serious misunderstanding. Not to mention all the evils ignorance and fear can visit upon superstitious humanity. For young magicians, dabblers, and dilettantes, the fantasy of waging magical war with a hideous demon who has taken up residence in some tormented soul reeks with the prospect of heroism, spiritual romance, and adventure. In truth, more often than not, where the subject of exorcism is concerned, the whole sad business merely reeks. As I feel I must keep reminding you, I'm not a mental health expert, nor do I have a degree in psychology. So please understand that my opinions on this subject are drawn purely from a magical perspective and from my experiences with individuals who have solicited my advice and or assistance, some of whom I felt actually needed an exorcism, though most of whom I believe did not. Let's bear in mind that the science of mental health is still in its infancy, and that in centuries past, maladies such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, depression, dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, and countless other conditions, both mental and physical, were believed to be the result of supernatural causes. The ancient physicians, who had attributed certain physical and mental abnormalities to demon or spirit possession, might not have been so off the mark, especially when we remember that their patients' spiritual reality included a solid belief in spirit illnesses and demon possession. Even today, rather than viewing a disease as our body's natural reaction to an unhealthy lifestyle, chemical or biological poisoning, or an inherited abnormality, we apply a personal face to the malady as a malicious enemy that needs to be resisted and battled and defeated. The wise witch doctor, shaman, or physician of old knew that if one could first heal the mind, the body would likely follow. If in the patient's mind the illness could be simply personified as a common garden variety demon, a bothersome pest that could be driven off by a skilled exorcist, then the immense negative energy of the patient's own fear and superstition could be turned back upon itself and used as a positive force to alleviate the illness. Inspired by healings chronicled in the New Testament, modern faith healers still effectively apply variations of this prehistoric art upon ailing members of their flocks, whose spiritual worldview is similarly superstitious, simple, and absolute. In this place, however, I'm not going to regale you with tales of exorcisms or faith healings, or even exorcisms in which and whereby an alleged discarnate entity or spiritual force is driven from the body and mind of an afflicted individual. Instead, I'm going to share with you a story of the exorcism of a school whose faculty and students were visited by a disturbing string of tragedies. It would be improper, indeed unwise, for me here to reveal the actual name of the school, or the city or state where it is located. I will tell you that it is an archdiocesan high school for girls that is administered for more than 100 years by a particular group of Dominican sisters, and that I was retained by the principal of the school, who I shall refer to as Sister Martha, under the circumstances I am now about to relate. Before I go any further, however, I must pause and remind the reader that the Roman Catholic Church has a formal rite of exorcism that, in rare occasions, and under the direction and authority of a bishop, is performed to cast out demons and evil spirits, a la the popular film The Exorcist. There are several reasons the rite is so infrequently employed today, one of them likely being the modern church's discomfort with something that appears so embarrassingly medieval, and another being the miles of ecclesiastical red tape involved in providing to the church's satisfaction the necessity for such a radical confrontation with the Prince of Darkness. The criteria for such proof are very specific and involved. If, however, the evidentiary hurdles are cleared, it can take an additional time to find a bishop willing to authorize the procedure. And if the bishop is unable or unwilling to do the job himself, to find an exorcist capable and willing to perform it, it often takes years to get a first-rate Roman exorcism on the road. More often than not, by then the possessee has gotten better or has died most colorfully before the exorcist walks out of the theatrical fog and comes knocking at the door. The reason a bishop is required to perform or order an exorcism springs from the Christian tradition that bishops are supposedly possessed of a kind of magical electricity that evil spirits hate, fear, and cannot resist. The Church, of course, doesn't refer to this power as being magical, but when they describe the nature of this force, one can conclude it can be nothing but magical. They maintain that this current is passed from individual to individual by the laying on of hands, with full intent to transmit it. In other words, one bishop makes another bishop by laying his hands on another man at least in those days it was a man, and saying something to the effect of, "John Doe, it is my intention to make you a bishop, and so I'm going to lay my hands on you and pass some of my magical electricity onto you. It's okay, I can make more." Supposedly, this magical juice comes down through an unbroken chain of guys who were touched by a guy, who was touched by a guy, who was touched by a guy, etc., back to the first century, to a guy who was touched by a guy who was touched by St. Peter. Now, please don't think I'm being unreasonably disrespectful when I observe that Peter, despite his other admirable spiritual qualities, was, according to the Gospels, probably the stupidest of the disciples of Jesus. How stupid was he? He was so stupid that during a rare outburst of exasperation, Jesus called him a rock. Now, contrary to the absurd interpretation concocted in the Dark Ages by an understandably confused and embarrassed church, calling somebody a rock in first century Palestine was not a compliment. In Aramaic, rock is a most insulting epithet. It does not mean, "I think you're heavy, man." It means, "I think you're an idiot, as dense and stupid as a stone." Jesus goes on to say something to the effect that it would be on such an immovable rock that the whole future church would be built. Obviously, in this instance, Jesus is proven to be a great prophet. This chain of magical electricity from Peter to the modern bishop is called apostolic, as in apostle, succession. Like electricity, the power, real or imagined, is in itself neutral. Once you have it, you have it. It cannot be taken away. If the church dared to admit such power could be taken away, then they would have to also conclude that it wasn't that all-powerful in the first place. Ultimately and technically, one's membership in the church, indeed in any church, has nothing to do with it. Faith or morality or personal piety or virtues have nothing to do with it. If you were touched by a person that has it, and if they touched you with the full intent to pass it on, then you have it too. Just like cooties. I realize that all this talk of bishops and magical electricity might seem a departure from the more colorful subject of this chapter. But I want you to know this, so that you may understand one of the reasons I was retained to exorcise a Roman Catholic school. The fact that even though I am not Roman Catholic or Orthodox Christian, I possess bishop cooties too. The circumstances that conspired to confirm this curious distinction upon me are interesting, but would take us even further far afield from the subject of this chapter. Suffice to say, I am a bona fide bishop, possessed of legitimate apostolic credentials from at least 30 lineages traceable to St. Peter or one of the other apostles of Christ. I think it's important for you to know, however, that I do not believe that being so consecrated imbues me or anyone else with extraordinary spiritual merit or magical power. Like anyone else on this planet, any virtues or magical powers I may or may not possess are born of the caprice of my own inherited destiny and my own efforts towards spiritual evolution. They are certainly not the result of being touched by a long string of guys who were originally touched by Peter the Idiot. Sister Martha's spiritual worldview, on the other hand, obliges her to believe otherwise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's how the events unfolded. It began with a conversation with my brother Mark. Mark had the conversation while giving a healing treatment to his Reiki instructor. For reasons even Mark cannot explain, he is a naturally powerful healer. And in the appendix of this book, I tell a little story about that. I tease him that his chi basket is broken and he just spills subtle energy everywhere he goes. Be that as it may, whenever his teacher falls ill, Mark is the only practitioner he allows to work on him. During the course of a treatment, Mark's teacher mentioned that his sister is a Dominican nun, Sister Martha, and that she is the principal of Our Lady of Sorrows High School in a nearby city. It is one of the oldest Catholic girls' schools in the state. She had recently complained to him how psychically unhealthy the old school building seemed to feel, and asked him if he knew someone who might come in and give the building a good spiritual cleansing. He told his sister, that he did indeed know someone whom he believed radiated an extraordinary amount of good energy, and recommended she contact my brother Mark. Sister Martha called Mark, and he agreed to come and give the school a good once-over. Several nights later, he was left alone in the building for the entire night. He systematically walked through and cleansed each room on every floor. It was nearly dawn before he finished. Sister Martha contacted him several days later and thanked him, adding the building felt much better. That seemed to be that. And Mark didn't hear from Sister Martha until she called him again a little over a year and a half later to tell him something terrible was happening at the school. She went on to describe a string of misfortunes and tragedies that had befallen the staff, faculty members, and their families in the last 30 days. It started with a car crash in which a young administrative assistant and her baby were burned to death. A few days later, a teacher, a man in his late 40s, announced he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He died within a week. The maintenance man severed a finger. The accountant fell and broke her hip. The staff was soon talking of a curse, and the more they talked, the worse things got. Every day brought a new and terrifying event: a broken bone, a breast amputation, unexpected illness, murder, or suicide in the family. To add to the litany of personal tragedies, the school building itself was starting to act strangely. Teachers arrived in the morning to find desks moved and papers strewn on the floor. A fluorescent light tube in a classroom ceiling burst, shattering shards of glass upon the heads of students. Whispered conversations in the teachers' lounge. They crystallized their collective terror and superstitiously personified the horrible chain of events as an attack by the devil himself. For the students, the most horrifying and traumatic event occurred just hours before Sister Martha phoned my brother. Sister Catherine, the school's most beloved and popular teacher, a vibrant young woman in her mid-20s with no known health issues, collapsed in her classroom and died in the throes of a grotesque and violent seizure before the eyes of her terrified students. Sister Martha was truly frightened and admitted frankly that she believed that there was an evil presence in the school that needed to be exorcised. Mark confessed that exorcisms were a bit out of his line, but said his brother was a ceremonial magician and a consecrated bishop who had participated in several exorcisms in the past. Sister Martha asked Mark to please contact me and see if we might be able to come to the school that night. Mark called me and repeated as much as he could. As you might imagine, this was something that interested me very much. I asked him to call Sister Martha and tell her we'd both come and meet with her, and if agreeable, stay the night in the building. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment, wondering what I had gotten myself into, how I would go about exercising a school building. What was it exactly I'd be exercising? It's my firm conviction that all schools are haunted, especially high schools, which even under the most ideal circumstances are seething swamps of chaotic sexual energy created by decades of confused and tormented adolescence. Hell, I still haunt the halls of my old high school and junior high. In dreams and nightmares, I find myself running late to a class, unable to remember the time of day or the room number. Sometimes I find myself climbing the stairs or trapped somehow between the walls of unremembered hallways. High schools are ghost traps, even for the living. How much more intense the energy must be in a very old Catholic girls' high school, where year after year, decade after decade, its spooky icon festooned chambers are crammed with hundreds of girls, all undergoing the mystifying metamorphosis into womanhood, all generating the immense and unpredictable psychokinetic energy that accompanies the uniquely female mystery of first issue of Blood. It is with good reason that when investigating hauntings and paranormal phenomena, the first question a professional investigator asks is there a menstruating girl or woman in the house? The premise of Stephen King's novel and film Carrie is not that much of an exaggeration. And so, I was not at all surprised that the school building itself was capable of snagging and enraging and a malignant force. What I didn't as yet know was exactly what that force was. Furthermore, I needed to figure out what magic formula would be appropriate for an operation like this. My mind was spinning too fast. I needed to pull myself together. I needed to ground myself. I needed to enter sacred space, a telephone booth to God, a place where the true, omniscient me talks and the not so omniscient me listens. As it happened, I knew of just such a place, and it was just a few steps from my telephone. I stripped off my clothes and stepped into the shower. There where the blessed hot water descends like the Holy Spirit from my crown to my toes, while my hands busy themselves with the automatic routine of the bath, while my brain runs on automatic pilot and my senses are engaged by familiar smells and sensation, my mind is released to listen to the great intelligence of which my own is merely the small and opaque reflection. I've composed entire songs in the shower. I've conceived books in the shower. Month after month, I figure out how to pay the rent in the shower. And that afternoon, before the hot water turned cold, I knew precisely how I would go about exercising Our Lady of Sorrows High School. And that's the end of part 1. We'll pick up part 2 tomorrow, the preparation. I hope you have a good day, and be good to yourself, and be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.